Hello, welcome to Sleep in History ASMR. Today we're going to talk about the history of the Polynesian Navigators and then hopefully answer the question, did they go to South America? So this is a very interesting history, and keep in mind that individual histories of all these Polynesian islands could just about be another episode. For example, Hawaii is going to have a very long and drawn out history that I just can't get into in one video. So I want to revisit that at a future time. So we're going to start by talking about how the ancestors of the Polynesians arrived on the Malaysian Peninsula about 33,000 years ago. Evidence for this comes from DNA of the Polynesians and comparing various genomes. So why did these people leave Malaysia and head east in the Pacific? Well, between 5,000 and 8,000 years ago, there was a migration of Northeast Asians. So these Northeast Asians came into the Malaysian Peninsula, and this migration led to conflicts between the Northeast Asian ancestors and the Polynesian ancestors, with the Asians winning this conflict. An important aspect of the foundation of the Polynesian race is a reverence for oceans. Such can be seen within Samoan and Manuan cultures today. The belief that the ocean is an inheritance from ancient ancestors, a gift from the gods, is prevalent. So starting with their original home, the Malaysian archipelago, the Polynesian people likely began exploring and becoming seafaring during this time around 5,000 years ago. Note that those people were different than the Aboriginal people who settled Australia, as that wave of human migration is thought to have happened many thousands of years earlier. So how did this era of navigation start? The navigation age in the Pacific likely began with the wave of original Polynesians that had migrated east from the aforementioned Malaysian Peninsula into Indonesia and as far east as Papua New Guinea. The development of the outrigger boat, which was essential to Pacific migrations, occurred sometime around 1500 BCE. These boats were widely used from Malaysia across Indonesia, Micronesia, Melanesia, and of course later Polynesia. The backbone of these boats was a single piece of hollowed out log. There were wood places on the side and two curved wood pieces that formed both the hull and stern. I'm going to show you pictures of outrigger boats, and we have the very basic outrigger boats that would have been used early on. And as time went by, they became a bit more advanced and allowed for sailing across longer distances. So I'm going to show you both of these. And eventually, as time went by, the original triangular sails that were seen on the original outriggers developed into more rectangular sails. So now I want to get into some clues that point to the migration. One archaeological site northeast of New Guinea on the island of the Bismarck archipelago. It's a site of the Lapita people, who are believed to have been ancestors of the Polynesians. The pottery that these people left behind set them in this area about 1200 BC. The pottery indicates a culture very widespread and present in many other sites, from the Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, and also New Caledonia and Samoa as well. One of the prevailing observations about the Lapita culture is that they were a combination of New Guinea people and also people that came as part of a migration from the Philippines. The Lapita pottery observations have indicated that a migration definitely occurred. Previously, it was thought that complex pottery indicated a vast trade network between Micronesia, Polynesia, and Melanesia. But coupling that information with DNA has made a connection where we now better understand that a vast migration took place slowly over thousands of years. The Lapita people began sailing along a route known as the Lapita Corridor, and we can see all this evidence from pottery. About 2000 BC, the Lapita sailed to areas such as New Caledonia, Fiji, Samoa, and Tonga. This was a 2,000-mile swath of islands. In some cases, the Polynesians were sailing against winds and very rough currents. So I'm going to flash up a picture of pottery and some of the evidence about how that spread throughout Polynesia. And you can see from this diagram how the Lapita pottery was found in many different places. So while I trace this map of Fiji, I want to talk about one of the more interesting theories about these island explorations and colonizations. This was proposed in Jeffrey Irwin's book, The Prehistoric Exploration and Colonization of the Pacific. The strategy that he proposed was probably one of the more logical explanations for how thousands of miles of islands that stretch across leagues of the Pacific could have been explored. The theory that he indicated, first of all, he stated the navigators would wait for a reversal of wind direction in order to sail east. They would only sail as far as it was safe to go with the supplies that they could carry on outrigger boats. And their return home could be made whenever the winds returned to their normal western direction. This would both minimize the risk and lower possible casualties. So it's only through an understanding of meteorology in the modern age that we now understand how both El Nino and El Nina affects wind currents and meteorological conditions worldwide. The Polynesian people did have an understanding, though, of this apparently, which led to rapid movements across the Pacific. This theory is backed up due to the evidence that shows west to east settlement. By the time James Cook arrived in Tonga in the 18th century, his crew had observed that a Tongan canoe could sail 3 miles to hour 2, as he said. Such technology, as simplistic as it was extremely effective in going from island to island. So now I'm going to take you through the different islands and present likely times that they were settled. First off, I want to talk about Lapita, and I mentioned that was in about 1600 BC. It spread from Papua New Guinea as far east as Fiji, Samoa, and Tonga. There's plenty of evidence within pottery to show a uniform Polynesian culture, which would lead to other places. And as I showed you on that diagram earlier, in 300 BC, Samoa and Tongans, who were descendants of the Lapita, discovered and settled the Cook Islands, Tahiti, and also the Marquesas Islands. In 400 AD, explorers from the Cooks and Marquesas Islands settled Hawaii. And finally, in 1000 AD, voyagers from the Cook Islands and other islands nearby settled New Zealand. These were the ancestors of the Maori people. Evidence for much of this also can be backed up by plants that are not native and also animals such as the rat that were not native to these areas. Hawaii was primarily settled by explorers from the Marquesas Islands. Much of this can be backed up with some physical DNA characteristics as well as language similarities between Hawaiian and Marquesan languages. So while I get into Hawaii, I want to go ahead and trace this map of Hawaii, and we're going to talk about how Hawaii was settled. Hawaii was primarily settled by explorers from the Marquesas Islands. Much of this can be backed up with some physical characteristics within the DNA as well as language similarities between Hawaiian and Marquesan. I'm going to kind of take you through some of these. So the English word shark, the Marquesan equivalent is the word mako. Also, another form of that word mako is mano. Hawaiian has the same exact word to describe shark, and that is mano. The word hunger, Marquesan equivalent is one or oki. The Hawaiian word for hunger is also one. So now I'm actually switching over and I'm going to trace the map of the Marquesas Islands. Lastly, the English word mat has a Marquesan equivalent of moina or moika. The actual Hawaiian equivalent of the same word is moina. So those are just a few examples. 56% of all basic words in Hawaiian and Marquesan are the same or similar. So you can see that linguistically, there's a lot binding the Marquesas Islands and Hawaiian. About 1500 AD, it is believed that voyaging between Hawaii and the rest of Polynesia had actually ceased. It is believed that during this time, Hawaii became more self-sufficient, and since it was further east than most places, it had no need for further voyaging and trade. So as I'm finishing my map trace of the Marquesas Islands, I'm going to start talking about Rapa Nui, and then we're going to get into some interesting theories about Rapa Nui and also South America. While it is a very small footprint of the Polynesian migration, the most impressive distance that the Polynesian navigators went and can be completely verified is on Easter Island, otherwise known as Rapa Nui. It is the furthest east of all Polynesia, over 1,200 miles away from the nearest Polynesian island and about 2,000 miles away from Chile in South America. On Rapa Nui, the Polynesians' most impressive footprint was the moai statues that dot the landscape. This demonstrates a thriving culture at one time that was later believed to have declined due to deforestation. The deforestation supposedly happened because of the introduction of the Pacific rat, presumably from other Polynesian islands. But was Rapa Nui the farthest east the Polynesians went? You may have actually figured out where I may be going next. Given that they made the 1,200-mile jump from Polynesia to Rapa Nui, is it possible that they went from Rapa Nui to South America just 2,000 more miles away? The answer is debatable, but there are signs to point that they may have had a minor presence in South America. Here are some possible markers. In 2007, a skull from the island of Mocha off the coast of Chile was found with characteristics of those consistent with Polynesian, not Native American or European origin. The skull has been dated about the 11th century, in the time after Easter Island was settled, and long before any Europeans made it to the Americas. This is not actually a new idea, though, as this was observed for centuries prior. In the 19th century, plank boats were used by Chilean natives that were similar to those used in Tahiti, which was actually observed by a French writer at the time who mentioned this. A British sea captain who had been to the southern tip of South America observed that the word used by Patagonian South American natives for a canoe, which is kaialu, is almost the same as the Polynesian word kaialoa. But the most compelling evidence is the sweet potato. The sweet potato was domesticated in Peru. The sweet potato requires human intervention in order to grow, as it needs to be physically planted. So if you look on the map on the screen, you'll see how the sweet potato was distributed at the time that the Europeans arrived. And of course, South America is where the Europeans were first introduced to the sweet potato. But later, once there had been more exploration of the Pacific, it became apparent that the sweet potato had already been present on many of these islands. And as time has gone by, it's become evident that the sweet potato was not native to these places in the Pacific. So the only way that it could have gotten there is by some kind of human intervention. There have been carbonized samples of sweet potatoes from as far west as the Polynesian Cook Islands that have been dated at 1000 AD. The conclusion is that it had to have been brought to these areas somehow, either by some sort of trade or perhaps some back and forth navigation between South America and these places. And once more, the word kumara or sweet potato is the same for natives living in South America, and also the word is identical in Polynesia, including New Zealand. So that pretty much is a clincher linguistically, I think. So I'm going to put up a quote on the screen by Captain James Cook. In the 18th century, Cook had made some observations about the Polynesian skill at sailing. And I think it's rather important when looking at what the possibilities were related to their exploration and how they get to many of these places. So Cook said, "These people sail in the seas from island to island for several hundred leagues, the sun serving them for a compass by day, and the moon and the stars by night. When this comes to be proved, we shall no longer be at a loss to know how these islands lying in those seas came to be peopled. Inhabitants of those western islands may have been at others, far westward of them, and we may trace them all the way to the East Indies." So I think that's a pretty interesting quote, because essentially he pretty much explained from an 18th century understanding of how all this came to be, and we can see that he was definitely proven right. So I'm going to start tracing a map of New Zealand, and I'm going to spend a moment talking about the Maori and their settlement of New Zealand. New Zealand is believed to have been the final frontier of the Polynesians. Former settlement of New Zealand likely began between 1200 to 1300 AD. They settled coastally and eventually spread inland over the next couple of hundred years. But there's an interesting legend of a man named Kupe who is believed to have been the first explorer to arrive in New Zealand. His father is said to have been from Rarotonga in the Cook Islands, his mother from Raiatea in French Polynesia. He's said to have landed near the Bay of Islands, which is on the northern tip of the North Island in New Zealand, in about 925 AD. Some sources have him arriving much later, but the lines often blur between him being a folklore figure and a historical one. Stories of Kupe killing a giant octopus seem to lean towards folklore, but what is truly known is that the Maori are likely descended from a Polynesian people that lived in the Cook Islands. Whether Kupe was the first of those and whenever it actually happened is debatable. So lastly, I want to get into a minor part about James Cook, but I'm mainly wanting to use this opportunity to kind of point out that many of the places that Cook had went had actually already been visited by Europeans previously. His voyages, though, were important because of the vast distances that he covered and the interactions with the natives, including a violent one with the Maori in New Zealand. And one in Hawaii where he met his final end. But the mapping that he did accomplish during several voyages helped make the lands more reachable for future ships and explorers. This would, however, bring waves of European settlers and diseases to Polynesian lands. Polynesian cultures and traditions have endured in many places, but a lot of those were never the same. One only needs to look at the Americanized Hawaii and also in New Zealand, whose Aboriginal culture of the Maoris was overtaken by British culture. On the island of Rapa Nui, it's worth mentioning that its proximity to Chile has meant a more South American presence, as many of the original inhabitants died of European diseases and left very few descendants to carry on that line and tradition. I appreciate all your attention, and thank you so much for watching my channel, Sleep into History ASMR, and see you next time.